My name's Tim Ellis. I've been a Sheffield Wednesday fan for as long as I can remember. I was born in Sheffield and I live here still, and I was one of many clergy who were involved in caring for the victims of the Hillsborough disaster.
An ambulance has just come into the stadium and it's making its way through a vast crowd of people away to the left. There would seem to me, from where I'm sitting here, dozens of people now lying on the ground and being attended to by police and St John's ambulance.
This is St Leonard's Church in Norwood, Sheffield, and from 1987 to 2001 I was the vicar here. And on the 15th of April 1989, about 3 in the afternoon, I was coming back from the church from a jumble sale and walking up the pathway to the vicarage. And as I walked along, I paused for a while and could hear lots of ambulances and the sirens on the top road about a quarter of a mile away.
But certainly the scene at the moment looks very, very serious. You may be able to hear the siren of the ambulance away to the left, and the trouble is the ambulance can't get through the crowd.
And then as I walked further up the drive and got nearer to the house, a parishioner walked by and said, and I heard that there'd been a problem down at Sheffield Wednesday football ground and that 1 or 2 people possibly had died. I went straight into the house and put the television on, and that 1 or 2 became 10, 20, 30 and 40. By the time it got to 3:30, I realised that there was a disaster unfolding, and so I got into the car and went down to the local Northern General Hospital, which is where the victims and their families were being taken. This is my story about what happened to me on that tragic afternoon and night. And it's also the story of other clergy like myself, men and women, who were involved with the victims of that terrible disaster.
Back of the goal, and the referee is taking the players off the field. So this FA Cup semi-final has been interrupted after 6 minutes because of crowd problems.
Being a passionate football supporter, I was, like many other passionate football supporters, sat down watching the pictures on the television of the semi-final at Hillsborough, and they suddenly switched and began to show something going terribly wrong, and by 3:15 I could see that there was some sort of disaster happening there in front of our eyes. And I thought, well, I better get down there to see what help we can give, because it could well be that people are in great distress and need the support that the church can offer under those circumstances.
The referee has stopped the game, and it won't resume until the problems behind that goal have been sorted out. Incredible scenes, as you can see, and still the crowd sways. Of course, it's a very...
Well, I was young, I was 28. I'd been ordained just a couple of years. At that stage, I was working at a church in Hillsborough, in the parish of Wadsley, just close to Hillsborough football ground. And I just moved 3 months previously to Hillsborough, and the football ground was just at the foot of our road, quite literally. And we could hear the crowds beginning to arrive for the football match that afternoon. My wife's brother is a very keen Liverpool fan, and she held the phone out of the window to him, saying, listen, can you hear the crowds as they're making their way down to the football ground? It's a great sunny afternoon, and there was such a joy in the atmosphere.
Every family had a clergy person looking after them, and yet they've not really ever looked at our side of it and what we were doing.
It was an FA Cup semi-final day, I think. It was going to be a big match that would kind of have an impact for a few miles around Hillsborough. And at the time I was living about 2 miles away. So I just thought the best thing for me, clear off. I played loads of tennis. So I went off to Wakefield, and there was a kind of club tournament that I kind of thought, this is where I'll go. It'll occupy me for the whole day. When I'd finished playing tennis, which was about 4:30, I thought, I'm going to go and see how the football match is going. And there was no commentary at all, apart from going to back to Hillsborough for an update. And I thought, well, I'll find out whether it's 3-1, 2-1, 1-0 or whatever. Find out now. But there was no football on. It was some great disaster that happened. And living so close, I was absolutely fascinated. And also, inevitably, wondered if I was going to be called or something. I had no idea what was happening.
At the time of the disaster, I was vicar of Woodhouse. I'd been in ministry at that time about 10 years. My previous experience, I was 10 years a management consultant. I was in the police in Kenya for 3 years, and before that I was in the RAF for 3.5 years. Yeah. I was in my clergy gear at Woodhouse, waiting to go across to the church to take a wedding service. And I was standing in my lounge, my younger son had the television on, and they suddenly cut to Hillsborough. And John Moxon's voice came on, and I thought, this is odd, because in those days they never broadcast semi-finals live. And he said, I heard him say there's been some trouble and people on the pitch, and it looks as though there are some casualties. But then I had to go across to the church to take the wedding. And I thought, well, I better not mention this, because 1 or 2 people may have heard it on local radio, but I don't want to spoil the day for the bride and groom. And if people locally have got relatives at the ground, they will be sitting there worrying rather than enjoying the service.
Well, it's nice to have you back up north again, Bill.
It's nice to be here too.
Yeah.
I'd been an engineer in Sheffield before I trained for the ministry. Then went to Nottingham to train for the ministry. That's kind of my time in Nottingham. And then did a curacy in Liverpool. And we'd moved from Liverpool back to Sheffield, where I became team vicar in the parish of Netherthorpe, which was the parish adjacent to Hillsborough. On that day, we were actually having a fundraising car wash in our drive. So our young people from church were busy washing cars in our drive. And it was after that had happened and finished that my wife and I and a friend, I can't remember who it was, but we were sat in our garden just having a cup of tea, I think, talking together. Vaguely aware that in the background there were sirens sounding a lot of the time, but really kind of, I guess, trying not to take too much notice of that going on, and just enjoying the sunshine and a nice time together. And then Stephen Lowe, the Archdeacon of Sheffield, rang to say he was aware something was happening at Hillsborough. He wondered whether I'd go down with him.
Why did you think that it was important for you to go down to the ground? What was the motivating force?
Well, I was probably the senior Anglican clergyman there. I knew my diocesan bishop, great the support though he was, wouldn't have been watching the football, and I just got on with it. And we also got our press officer involved as well fairly early on, and the diocesan was behind it all and giving me support in the background as well. But that's in a sense, Tim, the role of the Church of England under those circumstances. When there is a disaster, you will on the whole find that it is the Church of England who responds and takes the lead under those circumstances, partly because of the whole establishment thing.
There was a lot of traffic, the roads were kind of blocked. So Steve and I got out of the car and kind of ran down to Hillsborough football ground. I remember too, as we went down through Hillsborough itself to the ground, people streaming away from the ground, obviously, but utter kind of silence. And it just struck me even then that something had happened. I didn't know what, but people were kind of almost struck dumb.
What I can't understand, George, is why they don't open the exits behind the crowd and let the crowd at the back stream out, because the pressure is still coming down on the people at the front, and it shouldn't be really, because if everybody moves to the back or stays at the back or can get out from the back, there's crowds now trying to, or people getting up into the stand at the back to try and release the pressure, which is quite dangerous in itself.
We didn't have tickets for the match because it wasn't a local match. Sheffield Wednesday was the football ground, but of course it was actually Liverpool versus Nottingham Forest. And we were out to the Peak District with our friends very close by. And it was while we were out there and walking, and we stopped for an ice cream, and at the ice cream van, the girl there said, "Oh, have you heard the news?" And we said, "No, what's the news?" She said, "Oh, about the football." We said, "Yeah, how are they doing? What's the score?" And she said, no, it's been cancelled, they've stopped." And suddenly we realised there was something else going on, and she said, "No, they're asking for vicars and social workers to come to the hospital." And we realised that something huge was up at that stage.
The time's now 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I've come a few hundred yards down Herries Road to the Northern General Hospital, which is about 1.5 miles away from Sheffield Wednesday football ground. At this point in the afternoon, there was a constant traffic of ambulances backwards and forwards from the football ground to the hospital itself. When I walked into accident and emergency and asked where I could be deployed, I was met by a scene of absolute mayhem. Every nurse, every clergy person, every social worker, every doctor were trying to do their absolute best for everybody around them, but there was no organisation, no communication, and in the end of the day, the people who were flocking to the hospital to hear news or because they were injured were being let down. One of the significant things, because we're now talking about a time before mobile phones, before modern mass communication, was that there was only one public telephone available to the families and to the people who'd come with victims. And so I tried to get a suite of phones released in an office, and we managed to get 4 telephones in one place, and we managed to also then have a queue of people waiting to phone home to Liverpool and elsewhere with either good news or with bad news. This kind of situation, where we literally tried to organise ourselves by the seat of our pants, went on for perhaps 2, 3, 4 hours. And then at about 7 o'clock in the evening, we got a rumour, a call that we were all expected, particularly the clergy, to go down to the football ground itself. And so I got back into my car to drive the 3/4 of a mile to Sheffield Wednesday football ground.
And one has to remember constantly, this was a day before emergency plans, before mobile phones, before what we now take for granted in terms of facing up to major disasters. The situation was made worse by the fact that Radio Sheffield had started to put out an appeal for helpers to come as well. So at the same time as we were beginning to set things up, and I was doing a sort of cascade invitation to clergy to come in to help, people were turning up, some with Bibles clasped to their bosoms, completely inappropriate people. There were no checks, no validation available, and they had to be dealt with and turned away while we managed to get a cup of tea available and somewhere for people to sit and some sort of reception facilities available.
You say it was chaos, Peter. I mean, that was my experience as well, that just organised chaos. How did clarity come into that? So at what point and how did you understand what your role should be that night?
I'm not so sure that it ever did, for me anyway. I went down to a boys' club, I think it was.
Hillsborough Boys Club.
And there were that was a place where the kind of clergy and social workers were kind of meeting, being told what was happening. I can remember very little about that, except that a policeman kept standing up and saying, "This is happening, this is happening, this is happening." And the Archdeacon, Stephen Lowe, occasionally would stand up and say, "We need another 10 people up at the hospital. Please go over here if you're willing to go," or something of that nature. And so people went. I just went back to my car, drove up to the Northern General, and it was chaos there. I didn't know what was happening or anything at that point. And then eventually someone, can't remember who, told me I should be back at Hillsborough. And I could have sworn at the person. And so I got in my car, I drove back to Hillsborough, which is fairly close by, and then I was told to go to a place where all the dead bodies were being taken, which was the football club's gymnasium, I think.
This is Sheffield Wednesday football ground. About 7:15 on the 15th of April 1989, I found my way down here following the rumour that had started at the Northern General Hospital that we should all collect here. When I arrived, it was the gloaming, it was dusk, and I went in through the main entrance and walked across a completely empty pitch with all the lights glaring onto it. And there was still the debris of the afternoon's events around on the pitch and also on West Lower Stand where the disaster happened. As I walked through, we headed for the then gymnasium, which was at the far end of the building, and already there were about 100 clergy there. By the time I arrived, there was at least another 50, and Stephen Lowe, the Archdeacon of Sheffield at the time, who was responsible for this area, gathered us all together, and then for the first time in the afternoon or night began to organise us. I was asked to return to the Northern General Hospital, where I would meet with a family who possibly had lost a loved one at the disaster, and I was to lead them through the process which was gradually emerging.
I suppose about 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, the police made it clear that the temporary mortuary was going to be the place where people were going to be taken to identify the bodies. And would we go down there and work with social services, whom I ought to have said also became involved as our partners at the Boys Club? Would we transfer our operation, so to speak, from the Boys Club down to the mortuary, because we were going to need a massive presence there? The purpose was really to accompany people on a journey through the process that took place. I knew it was a journey that wouldn't end simply at the mortuary if it worked, because ultimately the idea was to provide a relationship of support and encouragement and presence more than anything else. So you were asked to be with them as they went through the identification of the photograph, first of all, to then accompany them to the unzipping of the body bag process, and then to go on with them, through that, and hopefully be there with them. Well, obviously in the unzipping the body bag process may very well be a prayer or something of that kind was appropriate. You had to sense whether that was the right thing to do, something they wanted to do, because you could have somebody who was just angry with God and that would be totally unhelpful, or you could have somebody who wanted more formal last rites and anointing and whatever. I got one of our heroes in terms of organisation, a man called Brian Cranwell, to stand outside the ground because the police made people queue up outside in the cold under the stand, which was an extraordinary, thoughtless thing to do. They went in sort of 2 by 2, in through these doors, straight into a board, a notice board, upon which all the faces of the deceased had been pinned in Polaroid picture form, and they were asked to identify the face of their loved ones.
I parked the car outside, away from the melee, and walked in through the gate into this. It was an open space, but covered in the back of the cop. Around the door appeared like a barn door. There were about 20 people who were waiting to get in, I discovered, to identify these photographs, which were taken with a Polaroid. There were 2 young policemen on the door who, when I say young, everybody looks young to me these days, but they were shaking. They were white-faced, and they were being crushed by these people wanting to be the next people in to see. And I felt very sorry for them, actually. And then there was a group of social workers standing in one place. There was a group of clergy standing separately, and there was a group of people from organisations like Crews, Victim Support, Samaritans, support organisations standing in another place. Some groups of relatives had like a Crews or a social worker with them. And I went up to one or two who'd got nobody with them, and a social worker came rushing up and said, "These people have already said that they don't need anybody to help them. It's their human right." And I thought, this is a disaster. I know from having been in the police myself overseas, you don't leave people who are traumatised just to wander around by themselves. They can get themselves they can be hurt themselves. And I thought, this is no good. We've got to have some authority. So I went to try and find a police officer, and I found a sergeant, and I said to him, "Look, this needs organising. These two constables are under pressure. There's people here who are at loggerheads between themselves as to who should help and who shouldn't, and there's people who are not getting any help." He said, "It's as much as my job's worth to do anything without being directed." I thought, this is ridiculous. I've been in the Air Force, I've been a policeman. You could get told off for making mistakes, but to do nothing when you know there's something that needs to be done, that was an unforgivable sin.
So I went back to the Northern General Hospital as asked and waited for my family to arrive from Liverpool. In the meantime, I was seeking assurances that when they arrived, they'd been told that there was a strong possibility that their son had died in a disaster. And I was assured all along, in the confusion and the chaos, that that would have happened. When I introduced myself to the family when they arrived and said that I would be leading them through the process of identification, it very quickly became apparent that they'd not been told that at all, that they were still harbouring the hopes that their son was still alive. And for me, that added to the whole pain of the situation that night. However, I managed to get them into my sports car, as it was then. We crammed into it and made off for the Medical Legal Centre, which is the mortuary here in Sheffield. And it's here that all the families and friends and relations who were arriving from Liverpool were held until they could go through the identification. We came here and there was endless cups of tea and coffee and chat and trying to maintain equilibrium, but all around us there was still misery, weeping and crying and questioning, and people shouting when they weren't getting answers. But mostly we sat in a kind of stunned silence for maybe 2-3 hours. Meanwhile, there were coaches coming backwards and forwards, ferrying people to the ground and back again.
You'd sent us back at that point. I was back at the Northern General. I'd been down to the ground. You said, "Can you go back to the North and meet this family? And there'll be a process by which you identify who you're going to be." And I kept saying to the people responsible for things, social work and others at the Northern General, do they know that their boy is dead? That will all be dealt with. We've told them this kind of thing. All that will be dealt with. And so my opening gambit as this family arrive is, my name's Tim. I'm here to just take you down to the ground, and and as soon as they heard that, they knew that they'd not been told. And
that's the cowardice of some of the other professionals who can't cope with actually imparting properly the bad news.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't my fault, but that's the thing that whenever I kind of get a guilt thing about it, I get a guilt thing about it. Oh God,
I was asked to go down to the Medico-Legal Centre, which is eventually where all the dead bodies were taken. And there were 95 bodies laid out. Now, I had seen one dead body before, but it wasn't a kind of regular occurrence for me to see that. To see 95 laid out was an incredible shock. And this went through my head as I looked at them all. All these people are dead. Yeah. All these people are dead. And it was just amazing for me. It really shook me.
I've never been involved in anything like that before, and just the volume, I think, was overwhelming. I mean, on reflection now, I guess, I think I was so taken up with the emotions, or the emotional kind of fallout, you know, from what was happening, that maybe more than at any other time in my life, I was experiencing a strength of emotion in myself that was surprising. I remember being really angry, for example, and I'm not usually an angry, well, not externally angry person, but I remember being in the centre and overhearing a conversation between a social worker and the family about whether it was husband or son who died, I don't know, but the social worker saying, well, I'm sure he wouldn't have suffered. And that made me so angry that the social worker could be so definite about what had happened to their family member, when, as far as I know, the social worker hadn't been there at the time, and there was no kind of evidence for anything. You know? I mean, I can kind of understand why I was angry now, but I say at the time it was a kind of shock for me to feel like that.
This is Leppings Lane, and the Leppings Lane end of Hillsborough Football Ground, and the West Stand, and it was on West Lower that the tragedy happened. I found myself back here at about 9:30 at night, this time with the family who'd come over from Liverpool, knowing that there was a possibility that they'd lost their son. I met them at the hospital, took them to the medical legal centre, and then brought them here. The setup was this. In the gymnasium, the bodies of all the people who had died were gathered. There was a policeman standing at the side of each one, often young and very ashen-faced. At the side of the gymnasium was a corridor, and in that corridor there was a queue of perhaps over 100 people. We have to remember that there were 96 victims, and people had come from Liverpool in family groupings, and so perhaps 600 to 1,000 people were involved in one way or another that evening. And so we were gathered in the corridor at the side of the gymnasium, and we queued until we reached the end of the gymnasium, where there were 2 hoardings with photographs of the deceased on them, at which point we identified the one we had lost. I then reported that to a police officer at the end of the corridor, and the body was fetched from within the gymnasium, and beyond the double doors to our right we identified the son of the family I had been asked to care for.
That night, the sounds sort of stayed with me, and the sounds were screams all the way through the night. The first scream and sob was when they identified the person they'd come to see. Then there was the sound of they would move forward, and the sound of the trolley being wheeled in the mortuary, with the body being put on it in the plastic bag. And then you heard the trolley being wheeled to the place where they were to identify them. Then you heard the sound of the zip, and then you heard the second scream, and sobbing, and so on. And then you heard that sobbing and screaming going on until the process started all over again with a new person. And that, the rhythm of all that was just horrendous.
As I think back to the events of that afternoon and night, it's the events in the gymnasium that for me are the fulcrum, the low point of everything that happened. As you stood there, you heard the confusion, the chaos, the crying, the weeping of people who thought or knew that they had lost people, all gathered around you, queuing behind you and in front of you. And then as you got to the end and you were identifying the photograph of your loved one, then you had the horror and the tragedy of that moment. If there is a hell, then it looked like that night.
Various people were brought to the Medical Legal Centre throughout the night, and we were asked to show them round through the picture process where they would see if they recognised their members of their family and so on. And this was the mother of a 14-year-old boy. And I would just have to say, she was lovely. I just wanted to give her a big hug. I didn't know whether we were allowed to or not, or what the law was, or anything of that nature. And she was crying, inevitably. And the thought of this lovely lady having a 14-year-old son who would come out to a football match, but who was just over a kind of glass screen, was dead. It was more than I could cope with, and I think I'm lucky I didn't cry, if lucky is the right word. But I wanted to, certainly.
I remember being there through until about 1:30 in the morning, when the vicar of the church that I was in Sheffield at that stage then said to me, right, Alistair, it looks like we're going to have to carry on through the night. There are services to do in the morning. Why don't you go home? Why don't I go home and get some sleep to be able to do the services? But that was later on in the night. But the emotions as going through the whole of the experience were, most of those that were injured were young men of my age. And that became quite evident quite quickly. And just the thought of fit, strong, young men having the life breath squeezed out of them was a very hard thing to come to terms with.
That went on until about 4 in the morning. And then Stephen Lowe said to me, I think we've broken the back of this. I don't think there are going to be any more new people arriving. He said, you better go, you can go home. Well, up to that stage, I had been focused on the job. When I started driving home, the tears rolled down my face. All of it. And one thing, I said a prayer about getting home and not having to stop too much, because my eyes were just filled up. Every traffic light between Hillsborough and Woodhouse was green. It was real answer to the prayer. If it had been red, I think I would have gone straight through them. It was just amazing, and I never forget that.
The Sunday morning, I was leading the service in the church, and I wasn't fully prepared for it because we'd set up to do the service together originally, and then there was a commotion at the back door halfway through the service, and a group of Liverpool fans still wearing their red shirts from yesterday came in, and we paused the service at that point and we found out who they were, and they were people who had lost people, and they just wanted to go to a church, and they'd found ours because we were one of the very closest to the football ground. And I had one of those heart in mouth situations. What do you do? What do you say then? Because there's nothing that's trite and easy. But for me, the Christian faith is clearly about a God who engages with the awfulness of our world, whose own son came and also died the death of a young man and came back to life again. And those signs of a young man's death and a rising to life were one of the key things that drove me then and drives me still. And that's not an easy thing, and it's not a trite answer to people who've lost family and friends in front of them, but it's part of what gave me strength.
My reaction was in part to want to cry along with people who were crying. And I think, to be quite honest, that probably for me has been one of the most obvious connections with my own faith of a God who is with us. And I wanted to be with those people who were, all I can say is literally going through hell. Yeah. I can't imagine hell being any worse than that.
I was aware that from concentration camps to natural disasters to disasters like Hillsborough. These are part of our world, and one of the callings of people of faith, and particularly people of Christian faith, is to recognise that the crucified Christ is actually part and present through his own death and resurrection within those sort of events. I mean, for me, that's very much about what the Passion narratives are about suffering and death and pain and loss and everything else. But through all that, something about the transcendent resurrection of God through that process, and the possibility of all that is there as well. And that's what hopefully we were offering by holding on to people. You know, it's standing at the foot of the cross alongside the grieving relatives.
Suffering of the innocent is the heart of the gospel. And I firmly believe that what we teach about the Christian faith is exemplified in this. That if we don't believe that, then there's no point in the faith.
I stood in those stands the days after and saw the debris on the ground. And so when I remember the overall thing and see that footage, I remember seeing myself standing there. Strangely, I think of the Derbyshire Peak District as well, because that's where I was when I first heard it. And the sense of the sheep on the hillside, and yet the disaster going on at the same time, and the discrepancy between those, and something of the sign of the Good Shepherd still works in that as well. The parish that I was curate at that stage was all around the Leppings Lane end, and there were only one or two public telephone boxes. It was long before mobile phones, so people were knocking on doors, just anybody's door, and saying, "Can we use your phone?" which is a bit of a strange thing to have asked even then. And I remember speaking to some of the members of my congregation who said, "Why do you want to use my phone?" I said, "Well, somebody from our group that came to watch the football this afternoon has died." Died? What do you mean? And they took on some of these strong emotions themselves. I remember sitting with one or two of the parishioners a few days later, weeping, unconsolable, about people they'd never encountered before, as they just shared that part of the journey with them too. Sheffielders, Hillsborough people were very struck by this disaster taking place on their doorstep.
Sheila Coleman of the Hillsborough Justice Campaign said this, Peter: "In many respects, the survivors of the Hillsborough disaster are the forgotten victims." Have you and I a right to see ourselves not just as carers on that night, but also in some way as survivors of it?
That's a fascinating one. And I think that, in a way, has been made even clearer recently with the appearance of David Duckinfield, one of the police officers, senior police officers, who was on duty. We met David Duckinfield, like a number of us, I think it was 2 or 3 days later, at the Bishop of Sheffield's house, where a lot of us who'd been involved were invited. And I met David Duckinfield, and he was shaking terribly, which indicated that there was something not quite right with him. And since then, he's gone through a very difficult time. I don't know the exact details of that. I'm not a friend of his, but I felt for him because I thought he was being one of those invisible victims.
The important thing to recognise is that we were all pretty well in shock after that night, and the clergy were in shock, and the police were in shock. But one of the roles again I felt we had to play was to acknowledge that this sort of event, there are human beings right the way across, the victims, yes, but the ambulance people, the fire service, the clergy, and all those people actually involved in the event. as well as the people at the ground we didn't really get involved in the same way with, were all damaged by it. And so we did try to do some work afterwards with them. The bishop and the archbishop were wanting to arrange an event where at least the major players from, if you like, police, including David Duckenfield and others, and the senior fire officer, ambulance officers and so on who were involved, could have a place where they could just talk together. So the Bishop of Sheffield arranged at his house for an opportunity to meet with the Archbishop of York, for those players to come along and spend an hour or two just talking and being listened to. And that's part, in a way, of the ministry of the church again, because there was no sense of blame or, why did you do this or why did you do that, but actually being there for a group of frankly broken people, because however much we may say he was at fault or this went wrong and so on, those men that day, and they were all men, were broken.
Do you feel that in certain circumstances the clergy who were involved that night have a right to see themselves as, in some senses, survivors of the Hillsborough disaster?
I think it's very easy in situations like this to take on self-pity. I'm not talking about the Liverpool people, I'm talking about clergy here and councillors. You take on this work. From the start, you are warned, if you're doing counselling training, of the possibility that you will see and hear things that will be upsetting. You've got to learn how to deal with them. But to take on the attitude, I'm a victim, if you're in that situation, I think is borders on self-pity. If, however, you are traumatised by the sheer weight of the sorrow and sight of bodies, then I think it's a different matter. I think then you are a victim. If you had been on the terraces and you survived, then I could understand people feeling guilty, because I've known people in traffic accidents who, how on earth was it she died and I didn't?
I feel, should I have objected and should I have done more and so on? What about the whole question of, proper follow-up and organisation? You think, well, maybe we could have done better. But on the other hand, Tim, looking back on it, it's like emerging from the dark ages in relation to dealing with major disasters. This was very early days stuff. We had no training, and actually what we were relying on was the basic instincts of clergy and social workers to do what they have been trained to do and be as human beings in the face of death. And those instincts, in my view, in the vast majority of cases, one or two I know didn't go as well as they might have done, but in the vast majority of cases was absolutely brilliant. And I'm proud of what we achieved that day. So it's a strange mixture. Yes, it was awful, and it was done badly in terms of the way in which the whole thing worked. But on the other hand, I'm so proud of what was achieved, on that day.
We talk in clergy terms about the early years of training for the ministry as formation for ministry, and this was one of the fundamental formational episodes of my life, and it stays with me very powerfully. Even now, I find myself referring to it regularly still. It still comes up. I wasn't prepared for it, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but it didn't make me lose my faith. I don't think it even made me question mine, because actually at a time like that I need the God who is the rock of my salvation, to quote one of the psalmists, to be there for that. A sense of a God who, whatever turmoils come to us, is able to still be there for us. And that's what was the strong thing for me. And as I was with some of these families, and as they went through the turmoil of the emotions, the ups and the downs that they did, and there's one family I was with throughout the next few weeks as they then prepared for the funeral and all that went with that. For me, they were looking for a God who was going to be stable at a time like this, and part of what they clearly wanted from me was someone who could sign that, be a sign for that, be a living sign for that in a way.
So at the last, here we are at the memorial at Hillsborough to the 96 people who died on that night. About 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, we all, the clergy, began to drift away from Hillsborough and to go home. I went back to my house in the dark, made my way to the bedroom, and then became very conscious of my 2 own sons lying peacefully in the bedroom next to me, 2 football-loving sons. And at that point for me, the floodgates opened. And what are we to learn from the experiences of the clergy that we've talked to in this programme? One of the things for me is that it was a very inhuman, brutal situation. And it does seem as though the clergy were amongst the people who brought back the humanity, the humaneness into the Hillsborough disaster. When all around was process, they brought in compassion and care. But for many, they had to confront the reality of life at Hillsborough, and that confrontation also was a confrontation of faith. For some, that meant that after Hillsborough they left the ministry and perhaps even the Christian faith itself. For others, like myself, it became part of the tapestry of faith. It tempered faith, and it made faith more real and more profound. And what happens here at Hillsborough, my theatre of dreams? Well, that night it became a theatre of nightmares for very many people, a nightmare which continues. And again, I think that the clergy were there to try and just point beyond that to some kind of hope. And the basis of that hope was in the compassion and the love that they showed. And so I'm constantly reminded of the words of Jean Vanier when he said that we're not here to be saviours, we're here to be little signs amongst thousands that love is possible.